Hey guys, tonight we begin with a man who conquered Europe but couldn't conquer his own restless mind. Napoleon Bonaparte, in the flesh, right in front of you, in a cramped tent that smells like licorice, sweat, and way too much citrus cologne. You're here, standing close enough to hear him breathing. It's slow, measured, like he's counting each inhale just to prove he's in control. He doesn't like to sleep, and even when he does, it's shallow, twitchy, more like a pause than rest. His boots are still on, his coat still buttoned, hat within reach, because the idea of being unprepared is worse than exhaustion. You watch as he chews on a piece of licorice, the dark stick rolling between his teeth, staining the edges in black lines that catch the candlelight when he moves. It's the 19th century version of your friend's nicotine gum addiction, except this man is ruling empires while gnawing on black candy to keep himself awake. He adjusts his gloves, pulling at the fingers, smoothing them down, eyes flicking to the seam like it might betray him if it's not perfectly aligned. You see the small scuffs on the leather, the places where he's pressed too hard, rubbed too often, tiny creases that speak of restless hands in the middle of long nights. Napoleon doesn't like stopping. Ever. You see it in the way his foot taps softly against the wooden floor, a steady, impatient rhythm that matches the slight twitch of his jaw as he chews. His eyes scan the space, pausing on the flicker of a candle, the corner of a paper sticking out from under a map, the uneven fold of a blanket in the corner. Control is everything. If he can't sleep, at least he can straighten the world around him. He eats quickly, when he eats at all. Bread torn in rough chunks, cheese bitten off in small pieces, swallowed before it even hits his tongue. You see crumbs clinging to the front of his coat, falling onto maps that are smudged with ink and fingerprints. He doesn't notice, or doesn't care. Food is just fuel, something to keep the machine running. And the smell. You can't ignore it. Layers of sharp citrus cologne, so thick it stings your nose, layered over the sour scent of sweat that no amount of perfume can hide. It's the smell of someone who hates baths, who thinks water is a waste of time, who would rather mask reality than pause to clean it away. He mumbles to himself, words spilling out in soft, low tones you can barely catch unless you lean in close. Names. Numbers. Sometimes Josephine. Sometimes just tomorrow. You get the sense that tomorrow is the only thing that matters to him, the next moment, the next breath, the next step forward. His eyes are dark, restless, moving even when the rest of him is still, and you can almost feel the weight of everything he refuses to put down pressing around him like the thick folds of his grey coat. And you, standing here, in this tight space that smells like fear and ambition, like ink and sweat and licorice, you see him as he truly is. Not the emperor in the paintings. Not the marble statue. A small man, always moving, always chewing, always straightening the edge of a paper that's already straight. A man who doesn't know how to rest, who doesn't want to rest, who can't rest. Because tomorrow, he will wake up before dawn, chew another piece of licorice, adjust his gloves, and keep going. Because that's who he is. Imagine it's barely morning, grey light creeping under the tent flap, and Napoleon is already awake. He doesn't wake up softly, stretching or sighing. He snaps awake, breath sharp, eyes flicking open like a switch has been thrown. He blinks once, twice, and sits up in the same motion, boots thumping softly against the floor. He hates mornings, but he refuses to let them beat him. The cold air bites at his face, and you see him flinch just once before his jaw tightens, before he shoves it down and pretends he doesn't feel it. The first thing he does is reach for his hat, fingers brushing against it like a child checking that his favorite toy is still there. Then his gloves, checking the seams, adjusting each finger before slipping them on, flexing once, twice, leather creaking softly in the quiet. He has a strange fear of drafts. You see him glance toward the flap of the tent, eyes narrowing at the small flutter of fabric, the breeze that sneaks in and dances around his ankles. He hates open windows, hates doors left ajar, convinced that a single cold breeze will undo everything, that a chill in the air could bring him down harder than any rival. And then, the water. He doesn't like it. He splashes cold water on his face anyway, quickly, harshly, as if punishing himself for needing it. You see the droplets glisten on his skin, dripping down onto his collar, soaking into the fabric, leaving dark patches he doesn't bother to wipe away. He doesn't wash more than this unless he absolutely has to. Baths, in his mind, are suspicious luxuries, a waste of time, a weakness. A man who rules should not waste hours soaking in warm water, no matter how much he smells like sweat and yesterday's licorice. And yes, the licorice comes out immediately. Before bread, before wine, before any plans for the day are spoken, he pops a piece into his mouth, biting down, jaw working, the bittersweet scent filling the small space. It's his comfort and his chain, a ritual that keeps the gnawing inside him quiet for a few moments. You see him pacing, small, sharp steps, back and forth across the narrow space. His boot sleeve scuffs on the ground, the rhythm steady, comforting in its predictability. Sometimes he pauses to adjust the collar of his coat, tugging it into place, pulling it tighter around his neck to block out that draft he swears he can feel. He checks his pockets, over and over. A letter from Josephine, a small charm he keeps hidden, a piece of folded paper with notes scribbled in his jagged handwriting. His hand pats each pocket, pressing against the fabric, making sure everything is still there, exactly where he left it, as if the world will fall apart if it isn't. There's a small toilet near his bed, because his bladder doesn't wait for dawn. It's something he hates, something that embarrasses him, but it's there, and he uses it, quick and efficient, barely a pause in the rhythm of his morning. A man who can command thousands, but who has to plan for the weakness of his own body before the day even begins. He mumbles to himself while he moves. Words like today, papers, no time, drifting out softly, as if speaking them makes them real, makes the day bend to his will. You see the focus in his eyes, the tightness in his mouth, the small lines at the corners of his eyes that deepen when he whispers Josephine's name under his breath, so quietly you almost don't catch it. Napoleon doesn't like mornings, but he owns them. He forces them to bend to him, each action deliberate, each movement a command to the day itself. And you, standing there, close enough to smell the licorice and the sharp tang of his cologne layered over sweat, you see him as he truly is. A small man, pacing in the cold, hating the breeze, chewing licorice to quiet the storm in his mind, refusing to let the weakness of sleep or the chill of dawn take a single inch from him. Because when morning comes, he will be ready. Because that's who he is. You notice how Napoleon eats. It's not graceful. It's not slow. It's survival, and nothing more. He tears bread apart with quick, impatient fingers, pieces too big, crumbs scattering across the papers on his table, sticking to ink stains and the edges of maps. You see him brush them away absently, the crumbs falling to the floor, ignored, as he takes another bite, chewing just long enough to swallow. He doesn't taste it. Food is a transaction, eat so you can keep moving, chew so you can keep thinking, swallow so you can get back to work. You watch him drink wine, watered down so much it's barely more than tinted water, but he drinks it because he trusts it more than actual water. He takes small sips, holding the cup close to his chest, eyes flicking around the room, even as he drinks. Ready. Always ready. And if you think he sits down for meals, you'd be wrong. Most of the time, he eats standing, leaning over a table cluttered with letters, reports, and that licorice he can't leave alone. He bites into a piece of cheese with the same urgency he gives to a sentence he's reading. The two actions overlapping, his jaw working while his eyes scan the page. You've seen him eat with his gloves on, too. No time to take them off. the leather smudged with oil from roasted meat, fingerprints on cups, stains on the cuffs that he will later try to wipe away with a damp cloth, cursing softly when it doesn't fully come out. And when he's done, there's no pause. No leaning back, no sigh of satisfaction, no moment of rest. He wipes his mouth with the back of his hand, wipes his hand on his coat, pops a piece of licorice into his mouth, and keeps going. Because for Napoleon, food isn't pleasure. It's fuel, and fuel should be consumed quickly so you can return to the real business of moving the world. You notice the way he hates noise while he eats. A clatter of a spoon, a sudden laugh, a cough too close, and you see him freeze, eyes narrowing, jaw pausing mid-chew. It's a look that says silence would have been better, a look that makes people lower their voices, shift in their seats, glance at the ground. He smells the food, even if he doesn't taste it. You've seen him sniff a piece of bread before tearing it, lean closer to a plate to catch the scent, the way someone might check if the world is safe before stepping outside. And sometimes he frowns, just slightly, if the smell is off, pushing the food away, reaching instead for another piece of licorice to clear his palate. And there's something almost childlike in the way he eats quickly, crumbs on his coat, stains on his fingers, the corners of his mouth catching bits of bread or cheese. But you wouldn't dare laugh. Not when his eyes are already looking past you, planning the next moment, the next move. Napoleon doesn't eat meals. He endures them. Because in his mind, every second spent eating is a second lost, a moment when the world might slip away if he's not paying attention, if he's not ready to stand, to pace, to command. And you, standing there, close enough to see the crumbs on his collar, the stain of wine on his glove, the small piece of licorice tucked between his teeth as he chews, you see him exactly as he is. A man who would rather chew licorice than enjoy a meal. A man who would rather pace than sit. A man who doesn't taste the world because he's too busy trying to control it. Because that's who he is. You can't ignore the smell. Napoleon's cologne hits you before you see him, a thick, sharp citrus and herbal cloud that clings to every fold of his grey coat, every thread of his cravat, every strand of his hair. It's strong enough to make your eyes water, cutting through the damp, smoky air of the room like a blade. You might think it's vanity, but it isn't. It's control. It's a shield against the world, against the truth of sweat and long nights and the body's weakness. He layers it on so heavily that even the scent of licorice on his breath can't overpower it. And there's always licorice. Always. He chews it constantly, slow, methodical, the black stick rolling between his teeth, staining the edges with dark smudges that match the ink stains on his fingers. You hear the quiet crunch as he bites down, the soft crack as he splits another piece with his teeth, jaw moving as he thinks, as he reads, as he paces. The licorice is more than a habit. It's an anchor. A small, bitter comfort that keeps his mind focused when sleep is a stranger, when hunger is an afterthought, when the world is too loud. He keeps pieces in his pockets, in small tins, in the folds of letters he rereads late at night. Always within reach. Napoleon doesn't like baths. Hates them, actually. Thinks they're indulgent, suspicious, a waste of time better spent awake, working, moving. Water, to him, is for splashing on your face in the morning, for wiping down the worst of the grime with a damp cloth, for the bare minimum of staying alive. He'll change his shirt, sometimes twice a day, but he won't sit in a tub. The thought of soaking while the world moves without him is unbearable. So, the cologne does the work, fighting a losing battle against the sourness of sweat and the reality of the body that refuses to stay clean. You notice how he rubs his hands, wiping the sweat from his palms onto the sides of his trousers. The leather of his gloves squeaking softly when he pulls them back on. The gloves are always there, even if they're stained, even if the fingers are creased from constant fidgeting, because they are part of the armor, part of the image he builds around himself. You see him sniff his own sleeve when he thinks no one is watching, a quick inhale to check that the cologne is still there, that the scent is still strong enough to hide what lies beneath. And if it isn't, he dabs on more, rubbing it into the skin of his neck, the wrists, the fabric of his collar, until the sharpness of it fills the air again. And there's something almost vulnerable in this man who won't take a bath but needs to smell clean, who chews licorice to keep the taste of the world off his tongue, who uses scent as a barrier between himself and everything else. You see the way he wipes at his face with a damp cloth at the end of the day, the water darkened with the dirt and sweat he refuses to notice, the cologne still strong enough to rise above it. He tosses the cloth aside when he's done, pulling on a clean shirt, adjusting the collar, popping another piece of licorice into his mouth before sitting back down to work. Napoleon doesn't rest, and he doesn't pretend to. His body is a tool, and he treats it like one, keeping it moving, keeping it working, covering it with the scent of something sharp and clean while the reality of exhaustion and grime hides beneath. And you, standing there, close enough to taste the licorice in the air, to smell the citrus and sweat mixing in the folds of his coat, to hear the soft crunch of him chewing while he reads by candlelight, you see him as he truly is. A man who fights the world, even in the smallest things. A man who won't let the truth of a body slow him down. Because tomorrow, he will splash cold water on his face, pull on his gloves, chew his licorice, and keep going. Because that's who he is. You notice how Napoleon treats sleep like an enemy he has to negotiate with. He doesn't crawl into bed with a sigh, letting the day slide off his shoulders. No, he approaches rest the same way he approaches everything else, reluctantly, suspiciously, ready to abandon it at the slightest reason. His bed is never truly slept in. The blankets are folded back, but only halfway, the sheets rumpled from him sitting on the edge, boots still on, coat still buttoned. Sometimes he lies down, but it's stiff, arms crossed over his chest or folded under his head, eyes closed but eyelids twitching, breath shallow. Sleep is a concession, a risk, something he allows himself only when exhaustion drags him down hard enough to force it. He's afraid of the dark, though he'd never admit it. You see it in the way he insists on leaving a candle burning near his bedside, the flame guttering low, throwing shadows that dance across the walls while he tries to rest. The darkness unsettles him, the silence of it too deep, too empty, letting thoughts creep in that even he can't control. Sometimes he falls asleep sitting up in a chair, chin resting on his chest, hands gripping the arms so tightly that his knuckles turn white. His boots stay on, his gloves sometimes too, as if removing them would be admitting he planned to sleep, and planning to sleep feels too much like letting his guard down. He talks in his sleep. Low, breathy words, fragments of sentences, names that slip past his lips in the quiet of the night. Josephine, sometimes, soft, almost a sigh. Other times, numbers, the same numbers he repeats to himself during the day, now murmured in the dark like a prayer he doesn't know he's saying. You hear him gasp awake, breath catching, eyes snapping open, looking around the room as if expecting something to be there, something waiting in the shadows. His hand goes to the papers on the table, to the letter tucked under his pillow, to the piece of licorice he left within reach, reassurance that the world stayed in place while he dared to close his eyes. Napoleon doesn't like beds that are too soft. He says they slow him down, make him weak. If he has a choice, he'll sleep on a cot, a hard mattress, something that will force him back to his feet at dawn with the stiffness in his spine reminding him that rest is temporary. He hates the sounds of night. A floorboard creaking, the sigh of wind against the walls, the drip of water somewhere in the corner, all of these make him flinch, eyes darting toward the noise, breath pausing until he decides it's nothing. And the worst is the draft. The tiny, cold breeze that sneaks under doors or through cracks in the window, brushing against his skin, making him shiver. He'll get up to check the latch, to stuff fabric into the gap, to stand there for a moment with his hand pressed against the cold wood, making sure it's closed. He keeps a small toilet near the bed because sometimes his bladder wakes him before dawn, and he hates the inconvenience, the reminder that his own body can interrupt him. It embarrasses him, this weakness, this small betrayal in the dark. You see him rub at his face with both hands when he wakes, hard enough to leave red marks, like he's trying to wipe away whatever dreams he doesn't want to remember. Then he checks the table, the pockets, the papers, making sure everything is where it should be before he moves on. Napoleon doesn't rest. He pauses. He lets the world slow around him for a moment, lets his eyes close just long enough to keep moving, lets the flame of the candle burn low while he pretends to sleep. Because even in the dark, even in the quiet, he is waiting for tomorrow. Because that's who he is. You notice how superstition isn't just a quirk for Napoleon. It's part of him, stitched into the seams of his coat, tucked into the folds of his gloves, hidden in the restless flick of his eyes whenever something feels off. He's afraid of cats. Yes, the man who faced betrayals, assassination attempts, and the crushing weight of ruling millions will freeze if a cat slips into the room. You see it in the way his shoulders stiffen, breath pausing, eyes narrowing as the soft paws move soundlessly across the floor. A cat's gaze makes him uneasy, those unblinking eyes that reflect candlelight, watching him without fear, without care. He'll clear his throat, shift in his chair, pretend to read a letter while glancing over the top of the page, waiting for the creature to leave. If it doesn't, he'll leave instead. You might laugh, but to him, it's not a joke. Cats are omens, unpredictable, reminders that some things cannot be controlled, and that bothers him more than he will ever say. He believes in signs. The way a candle flickers when a door opens. The sudden gust of wind that makes papers flutter across the table. The way the sky looks before dawn, the call of a bird too early, too loud. Each is a message, something to be read, something to be noted. If a black cat crosses his path, he'll change direction. If a mirror cracks, he'll sit for a moment, jaw tight, fingers drumming against the table, before getting up to leave the room without looking back. If a candle goes out unexpectedly, he'll relight it with a small, sharp movement, eyes on the flame as it returns, as if daring it to fail again. He keeps small charms in his pockets, tokens and talismans gifted or taken, each with a meaning only he understands. A smooth stone, a small medal, a scrap of fabric tied in a knot. You see him touch them absent-mindedly, thumb brushing over the edges as he paces, as he reads, as he chews his licorice. Sometimes, he mutters small prayers under his breath. Not the grand, cathedral prayers, but quiet, personal ones, half-formed words asking for protection, for clarity, for another day where he wakes up and the world still belongs to him. Napoleon notices the moon, too. If it's full, he'll stand at the window for a moment, eyes narrowed, watching the silver light, arms folded across his chest. He doesn't say why, but you see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tap against his sleeve, a rhythm that only he understands. He counts things when he's anxious. The buttons on his coat, the folds in a curtain, the lines on a page. You see his lips move, silent numbers, a ritual that steadies him when the world feels just a bit too uncertain. And the drafts. Always the drafts. If a breeze slips through a crack, he'll stop mid-sentence, eyes flicking to the source, moving to block it with fabric. With paper, with anything to keep it out. To him, a draft is a whisper of illness, of weakness, of something creeping in to undo him while he isn't looking. You see him knock on wood twice, after saying something important. A soft, quick rap of knuckles against the edge of a table, so fast you'd miss it if you blinked. Insurance against the unknown, a small gesture that lets him keep moving without the thought clawing at him. Napoleon isn't superstitious because he's weak. He's superstitious because he wants to control what can't be controlled, to manage the chaos that even he can't command with orders and discipline. And you, standing there, watching him touch the charm in his pocket, watching him glare at a cat that slips under a table, hearing the quiet knock of his knuckles against wood, you see him as he truly is. A man who moves worlds, but checks for omens first. A man who leads, but never ignores the flicker of a candle. Because tomorrow, he will count the buttons on his coat, chew his licorice, glare at the cat, and keep going. Because that's who he is. You notice how Napoleon treats getting dressed like a small, private battle. It starts with the gloves. He checks them every morning, running his fingers along the seams, pressing each fingertip, making sure the leather is smooth, that there are no tears, no loose threads daring to exist under his command. You see him flex his fingers, once, twice, the gloves creaking softly, his eyes flicking down to watch the movement like it matters more than breakfast. And it does, for him. The gloves are part of the armor, part of the mask. They hide the ink stains on his fingers, the nail he chewed too short, the small cuts from tearing open letters too quickly. They give him control over his hands, hands that are always moving, always tapping, always restless. Then comes the coat. Grey, always grey, though sometimes darker, sometimes lighter, depending on the day, the mood, the weather. It isn't always clean, but it's always brushed, the dust and crumbs swept away, the fabric smoothed down with quick, practiced hands. He'll shrug it on, pulling at the shoulders until it sits just right, tugging the collar into place with small, precise movements. You see him pause after putting it on, rolling his shoulders, testing the weight of it, as if making sure it's ready to carry the day with him. The collar matters. You've watched him adjust it over and over, fingers flicking at the edges, pulling it higher, flattening it down, checking in the small, scratched mirror he keeps nearby. If it folds wrong, if it creases, if it doesn't sit perfectly, he will stop everything else until it does. The cravat is next, wrapped around his neck, tied in a way that looks effortless but takes him 3, 4, sometimes 5 attempts before it feels right. He'll tilt his head, checking the symmetry, tugging gently to tighten it, smoothing the fabric with a gloved hand, watching his reflection to see if it holds. Napoleon hates hair that won't behave. He'll run his hand over it, pressing it flat, combing it quickly, the dark strands slick back, a few always escaping to fall across his forehead. Those few strands annoy him. You see him blow them away with a sharp breath, eyes narrowing as he tucks them back, only for them to slip forward again when he looks down. And then the hat. The hat is not just clothing. It's a shield, a statement, a shadow he can hide beneath when he doesn't want people to see where he's looking. He picks it up carefully, fingers brushing off any dust, checking the edges, the lines, the shape. He sets it on his head, tilting it just so, pulling it lower if the light is too bright, lifting it slightly if he needs to see the room. You've seen him adjust it even when it's already perfect, a small tug, a tilt, a moment of quiet checking before he's satisfied enough to move on. Napoleon doesn't dress for comfort. He dresses for readiness. The boots are heavy, worn, the leather cracked in places but polished on the toes where it matters, where people see. He pulls them on with quick, efficient movements, standing to stamp his feet once, twice, testing the fit. The feel, the readiness to walk, to move, to keep moving. And you notice how he checks himself once it's all done. Standing there, gloved hands brushing down the front of his coat, adjusting the cuffs, flattening the fabric over his chest. A small exhale, a nod to himself, a glance in the mirror to confirm that everything is where it should be. Not because he wants to look grand, but because it's about control. The small, sharp details he can command before the day begins to throw things at him that he can't. And there's a strange intimacy in watching him do this, in seeing the human behind the legend, a man fussing with a fold in his cravat, scowling at a piece of hair that won't stay down, rubbing a thumb against a smudge on his glove until it fades. You see a man who will chew licorice after dressing, standing near the door, tasting the bittersweet sharpness as he breathes in, the smell of cologne and leather and morning clinging to him, ready for the day. A man who dresses not to impress, but to armor himself. Because tomorrow, he will pull on the same gloves, adjust the same hat, straighten the same collar, and walk out ready to keep moving. Because that's who he is. You notice how Napoleon doesn't like being touched. Not a gentle pat on the shoulder, not a sleeve brushing against his arm, not even the well-meaning hand of a valet trying to adjust his coat. Any unexpected contact makes him flinch, a small, sharp recoil that's gone as quickly as it appears, replaced by a hard stare or a clipped word. It's not fear exactly. It's more like the world pressing too close, like other people's hands reminding him that he's made of skin and bone, that his body can be reached, interrupted, claimed for a moment by someone else. So he keeps distance. A small, invisible space around him that everyone learns to respect. Even those closest to him know not to linger too near, not to brush against him when handing him papers or helping him with gloves. He doesn't like crowded rooms. The crush of bodies, the hum of voices too close, the constant shifting and accidental nudges make him tighten his jaw, his eye scanning the room for the quickest exit, fingers tapping against the side of his leg as if counting the seconds until he can leave. And yet, he needs people. Valets, aides, secretaries, those who move around him, helping him dress, bringing him letters, pouring him wine. You watch how he interacts with them, a strange dance of need and impatience. He gives them nicknames, strange little names that don't always make sense, calling them by words that stick, that replace real names, as if it's easier for him to manage people when they become a label, a function, something smaller than a person. You hear him call one valet Sparrow because of the way the man moves quietly, quickly, never making noise. Another he calls Cloud because he always seems to appear without warning, soft-footed, waiting for instructions with downcast eyes. He never says these names with malice. There's almost a hint of warmth in them, a familiarity he can handle, as if these names create a distance he needs while allowing him to keep them close enough to function. Napoleon doesn't like small talk. If you speak to him, it must be for a reason, and you see the flicker of annoyance in his eyes when someone tries to fill the silence with chatter. He prefers silence, the quiet hum of a room where the only sound is the rustle of papers, the soft creak of leather as he shifts in his chair, the gentle crackle of a candle. You notice how he watches people while they speak, dark eyes sharp, unblinking, the weight of his focus so intense it makes them stumble over their words. And when he decides the conversation is over, it is. He turns away, shifts his attention, leaves the person standing there, dismissed without a word. But there are moments, rare and quick, when you see something softer. A tired nod of thanks when a valet brings him tea, the smallest curl of a smile when someone hands him a letter from Josephine, the way his eyes soften for a breath before the steel returns. Napoleon likes to be served quickly. If a button takes too long to fasten. If boots aren't ready when he needs them, if the coffee is cold, you see the flash of irritation, the small exhale through his nose, the sharp, quiet rebuke. He won't shout, but the disappointment in his eyes is enough to send a valet scurrying to correct the mistake. And when it's done right, when the coat sits perfectly, when the gloves are handed to him at the exact moment he needs them, when the room is quiet and efficient, you see him relax just slightly, a tension in his shoulders loosening for a single breath before the restlessness returns. He chews licorice while people speak to him, jaw moving, the scent of anise filling the air, a signal that he's listening but that his mind is already moving elsewhere, planning, considering, dismissing, accepting. Napoleon's world is built on control, and other people's presence is the one thing he can never fully command. So he keeps them close, but only close enough, managing interactions like he manages the fold of his collar, the placement of his gloves, the tilt of his hat. And you, standing there, watching him flinch when someone brushes against him, hearing him call a valet sparrow with a rare softness, seeing him chew licorice while someone stammers through a report, you see him as he truly is. A man who needs people, but only on his terms. A man who craves distance, even as he demands presence. Because tomorrow, he will button his coat, chew his licorice, nod once, and keep moving. Because that's who he is. You notice how the letters change him. Napoleon, who moves through rooms like a storm bottled up in a small frame, who snaps awake before dawn and refuses to rest, becomes different when he holds a letter from Josephine. His fingers, usually quick and restless, slow down as they trace the seal, turning the paper over, eyes scanning the handwriting on the outside. He holds it close to his face, breathing in, as if hoping the paper might carry the scent of her perfume, or at least the warmth of her hand. And for a moment, he isn't the emperor. He's just a man, standing there, staring at a piece of folded paper, the world quiet around him. Then he tears it open, not carefully, but with urgency, the seal breaking under his thumb, the paper unfolding with a soft crackle that sounds louder than it should in the hush of the room. You see his eyes dart across the lines, reading quickly, then again, slower, the words sinking into him in a way nothing else does. His jaw tightens, loosens, his lips pressing together, sometimes curling into the faintest, rarest smile. He mutters her name, Josephine, under his breath, so softly it's almost as if he's reminding himself she's real. The man who can't stand clutter keeps her letters. They pile up in drawers, tucked between maps, folded into pockets, hidden under his pillow. Pages creased and worn from being read over and over, the ink smudged by the press of his thumb, by the dampness of a room too cold to keep dry. And then there's the letter he wrote to her, the one people still talk about, the don't wash letter. A note sent before he returned from campaign, telling her not to bathe so he could be greeted by her scent, the raw, unfiltered reality of her, the woman he missed in a way that made him reckless. You think about that when you see him, a man who bathes rarely, who masks himself in sharp citrus cologne, asking her not to wash because he wants the truth of her more than the illusion of cleanliness. It's oddly human, oddly tender, a strange contradiction in a man who hates mess but craves the honest messiness of love. You see him rereading her letters late at night, licorice between his teeth, candle burning low, the shadows painting lines on his tired face. His eyes follow the lines of her words, his free hand rubbing over the corner of the paper, the way a child might smooth the edge of a blanket for comfort. Sometimes, you see him close his eyes, pressing the letter against his lips, exhaling softly, as if letting himself feel it, just for a moment, before folding it back up and tucking it away, the softness gone, the steel sliding back into place. Napoleon, who scolds valets for a misplaced button, who straightens papers and checks his gloves 5 times, can be undone by a few lines in Josephine's hand. That's the contradiction. The man who can command armies, who won't pause to enjoy a meal, who can't tolerate the scratch of a hair out of place, will pause for a letter, will pause for her, will let himself be vulnerable, but only for a breath. And you, standing there, watching him press the paper to his lips, hearing him whisper her name, seeing the softness that flickers across his eyes before it's buried under the weight of tomorrow, you see him as he truly is. A man who is terrified to stop, but who will stop for love. A man who is all control, but who can be disarmed by ink on a page. Because tomorrow, he will put the letter away, pull on his gloves, chew his licorice, and keep moving. Because that's who he is. You notice how even Napoleon can't escape the body. He might conquer rooms with his presence, command attention with the flick of a hand, bend people's days around his rhythms, but when it comes to the needs of the body, he is as human as anyone else. He hates it. The interruptions. The reminders that hunger comes, that thirst follows, that the body demands things from him he can't simply command away. You see it in the way he eats quickly, barely tasting, wiping crumbs from his coat with an irritated swipe, and you see it most clearly in the way he handles what comes after. He has a small toilet, nothing grand, nothing hidden. Just a simple pot, placed near his bed, close enough that he can use it without leaving the warmth of blankets on cold nights. A reminder that even an emperor can't escape the call in the middle of the night, the way the bladder insists, the way the body refuses to wait for dawn. It bothers him. You see the slight grimace, the way his lips press together, the quiet sigh when he has to use it, the way he glances toward the door to make sure no one will enter, to make sure the world won't see this small, unavoidable weakness. He has a sensitive stomach, too, and it frustrates him. Spices can unsettle him, rich foods can turn his stomach, and he knows it. Yet he still eats quickly, tearing bread, swallowing wine, biting into cheese with a sharp impatience, and sometimes paying for it later, pacing with a hand pressed to his midsection, jaw tight, breath short. You see the cologne again here, too. He uses it to drown out the scents of the room, the scent of himself, the scent of the world that he cannot fully clean away. A sharp citrus cloud, laid over the air, heavy and demanding, refusing to let the reality of human living take center stage. It's almost funny, in a quiet way, watching him, the emperor, the restless force, tiptoeing around the most human parts of himself, trying to manage them with the same discipline he uses to manage papers and people. He checks the pot himself after, making sure it's cleaned, making sure it's placed exactly where it was, as if the control of this small detail makes the indignity of needing it less sharp. You notice how he keeps water close, but drinks sparingly, measuring out sips rather than gulps, always wary of how much his body can hold before it demands to be emptied again. It's a constant calculation, a quiet management of himself, a reminder that even when the world obeys him, his body never fully will. And there's something almost comforting in that. Something that makes him human, makes him small in the way that we all are, forced to pause, to answer the call of the body, to submit to the needs that no power can erase. You see him straighten his coat after, adjust the fold of his cravat, pull on his gloves, glance once at the pot before looking away, before lifting his chin, before letting the moment pass as if it never happened. Because he will not let it stop him. Because tomorrow, he will eat quickly, drink carefully, use the small pot near his bed, and still wake before dawn, chewing licorice, adjusting his gloves, ready to move. Because that's who he is. You notice how Napoleon lives in a world of small sounds. Tiny creaks in the floorboards, the soft click of a latch, the flutter of a page caught by a breeze, things you might ignore. He does not. His eyes flick toward the sound instantly, a small tension pulling at his jaw, a breath pausing mid-exhale. Loud noises bother him, but it's the small ones that truly catch him off guard. A cough too close, a spoon clattering to the floor, the scrape of a chair against the ground, sharp and sudden. His head will turn, eyes narrowing, shoulders stiffening for a fraction of a second before he forces himself back to stillness. Even at rest, his ears are awake, always listening, always tracking the world around him. You see it in the way he reacts to voices, too. He prefers quiet, low tones. Too much chatter irritates him, makes his fingers drum against the table, his heel tap lightly against the floor, a restless rhythm that betrays how the noise is crawling under his skin. If a room is too loud, you'll see him stand, adjusting his coat, clearing his throat softly, waiting for silence to fall before he continues with what he needs to say. The silence itself becomes part of his presence, a tool he uses to quiet the world so he can think. He notices smells, too. The scent of ink drying on paper, the tang of iron in water, the musk of damp wool after rain, the burnt edge of a candle wick. They catch in his nose, small reminders of the room around him, of the world pressing close in ways he can't ignore. And, of course, the cologne. The sharp citrus and herbal scent that he wears like armor, overpowering the smells of sweat and smoke and human breath that might otherwise unsettle him. You see him lift his wrist to his nose sometimes, checking, breathing in the scent to ground himself, to remind himself that at least this scent, is his. Napoleon's world is texture, too. The smoothness of a glove's leather under his fingers, the crisp edge of a paper he folds and refolds, the roughness of a coat seam he tugs at until it feels right. He notices the way fabric folds, the way it sits against his skin, the way it moves when he shifts. You see him brushing a sleeve, tugging at a cuff, running his thumb along a crease until it flattens, all in the middle of a conversation, all while his mind is elsewhere, but his senses refuse to let him ignore the small wrongness of a wrinkle or a rough seam. He tastes the world in small ways, too. The licorice, always present, a bitterness he prefers over the blandness of bread or the thin sharpness of watered wine. The licorice is control, a taste he can manage, a taste that does not surprise him. And the drafts. Always the drafts. A breeze slipping under a door, a window not fully latched, a curtain stirring when it shouldn't, these are offenses that must be corrected immediately. He will stop, mid-sentence, mid-step, to close the gap, to shut out the breeze that might carry with it a chill, an illness, a reminder that there are things he cannot see or command. Napoleon's world is a constant hum of sensory detail, a tight weave of small sounds, smells, touches that others let pass unnoticed. For him, they are part of the world he tries to control, the chaos he tries to quiet, the environment he tries to bend to his will. And you, standing there, watching him pause at the sound of a drop pin, seeing him adjust a cuff until it's flat, watching him breathe in the sharpness of his cologne to clear the room's smell from his mind, you see him as he truly is. A man who commands armies, but flinches at a draft. A man who demands silence, who notices the flutter of a page, who moves through the world in a constant dance of small corrections. Because tomorrow, he will straighten his collar, chew his licorice, close the window against the breeze, and keep moving. Because that's who he is. You notice how Napoleon counts. Not just numbers on paper, not just tallies of supplies or letters received or hours passed. He counts everything, everywhere, silently, under his breath, like a low hum only he can hear. Steps across the room. Taps of his finger on the table. Lines on a page before he turns it. Breaths between words. You see his lips move sometimes, a small flicker, as he mouths the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, a pause, then again, like a rhythm that keeps him steady when the world won't. It's like a fidget spinner, but in his mind, spinning to keep the thoughts from spiraling too fast. He'll touch the corner of a paper 3 times before moving it. He'll straighten a stack, then tap it twice, once more for certainty, before setting it down. You watch him knock on wood quietly, 2 small raps of his knuckles, after speaking something important, a whisper of superstition wrapped in a habit of control. Napoleon likes order, but not the clean, empty kind. He likes controlled clutter, papers stacked high, but in an order he knows by heart. A cup set just so on the edge of the table, a pen always within reach, a piece of licorice ready to chew the moment his jaw goes still. And the gloves. Always the gloves. He'll put them on, flex his fingers, take them off, check the inside, slide them back on, press the seams flat, tug at the wrist, then move on. Even while speaking to someone, his hands are working, testing the gloves, folding, smoothing, ensuring they're exactly right. You notice how he checks the time, too. Pulling out a pocket watch, flipping it open, snapping it shut, glancing at the face, then tucking it away, only to pull it out again moments later. It's not about the hour, it's about the reassurance that time is still there, still ticking, still moving the way he needs it to. If a curtain moves, he will adjust it until it hangs evenly. If a candle flickers oddly, he will move it to a different spot on the table, watching the flame until it steadies. If a piece of lint appears on his coat, he will stop everything else to pluck it off, flicking it away with a small frown before returning to whatever he was doing. These are the small controls in a world too big to fully manage, the tiny rituals that let him feel, if only for a moment, that everything is exactly where it should be. You see the tension in his jaw when something is out of place. A book turned the wrong way on a shelf, a shoe angled slightly off from its pair, a wrinkle in a folded cloth. His eyes catch it, lock onto it, and he cannot let it go until it is fixed, adjusted, aligned. Napoleon lives in a world of small corrections. It's as if he believes that if he can keep the edge of his cuff flat, the rest of the day will follow. If the glove fits perfectly, the world will obey him. If the steps across the room are counted just right, the chaos outside the walls will stay outside, if only for a little while. And you, standing there, watching him touch a paper 3 times before moving it, seeing him adjust the candle until the flame is steady, hearing him count under his breath as he crosses the floor, you see him as he truly is. A man who rules, but still needs the reassurance of numbers. A man who controls, but only because he fears what happens when he doesn't. Because tomorrow, he will wake before dawn, count the steps to the table, chew his licorice, adjust his gloves, and keep moving. Because that's who he is. You notice how Napoleon prefers corners. Not grand halls, not wide open spaces with high ceilings and echoing footsteps, but corners. Small spaces. Rooms where the walls are close, where the edges are clear, where everything can be seen and managed without turning his head too far. You see it when he enters a room, eyes flicking quickly across the space, scanning for the corner that feels safest, the spot where he can sit with his back protected, the walls close enough to press the world into something he can handle. He doesn't sprawl across chairs or lounge across sofas. He sits perched, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, hands steepled or tapping against each other, boots planted firmly on the floor, ready to stand at any moment. There's comfort for him in smallness. A cot in a tight room feels better than a large bed in a vast space. A narrow hallway feels easier to walk than a wide courtyard. He likes spaces where the ceiling feels low, where the shadows can't hide things, where the light touches every corner. You've seen him choose a seat that lets him see the door, the windows, the movement of everyone around him. It's not paranoia exactly, but the need to know, to watch, to never be caught unaware. He says less in large rooms. The noise feels heavier there, voices bouncing, footsteps ringing, too many people moving at once. His eyes shift more, jaw tightens, hands fidget, tapping against the arm of a chair, twisting a ring, adjusting the fold of his cravat as if to ground himself. In small rooms, his voice feels stronger, more focused, words coming out clear, sharp, controlled. He leans forward when he speaks, eyes fixed, presence pressing outward to fill the room without effort. In a small space, there is nowhere for distractions to hide, nowhere for silence to slip away. You notice how he sleeps best in confined places, too, if he ever truly sleeps. A cot tucked into a corner, a blanket pulled tight around his shoulders, boots still on, the scent of licorice and cologne hanging in the close air. There, the world feels contained, quiet, manageable. Even in carriages, he finds comfort. The rocking motion, the narrow benches, the way the small windows frame the world in tidy scenes passing by. You see him sitting there, arms folded, hat tilted low, the occasional flicker of his eyes toward the view before closing them again, resting, or appearing to rest, within the safe boundaries of that rolling box. There's humor in it, quietly, watching a man who can command crowds, who can silence a room with a look, who can bend people to his will, choosing to sit in corners, to hide in small spaces, to prefer the safety of narrow rooms over the glory of grand halls. It's not fear, not exactly. It's about control, the kind that comes when the world is close enough to touch, to adjust, to correct if it steps out of line. He needs the nearness of walls, the firmness of edges, the security of seeing where everything begins and ends. And you, standing there, watching him sit on the edge of a narrow chair, boots tapping quietly against the floor, fingers drumming against a folded piece of paper, eyes calm in the closeness of the room, you see him as he truly is. A man who commands wide spaces but feels safest in small ones. A man who can stand before thousands but finds comfort in corners. Because tomorrow, he will step out into the wide world again, chew his licorice, adjust his gloves, straighten his coat, and keep moving. But tonight, he will find a corner, a small space to sit, to breathe, to let the world grow quiet around him. Because that's who he is. You notice that for all his sharpness, Napoleon has a strange sense of humor. Not loud laughter or open chuckling, but quick, dry remarks, the corner of his mouth twitching for a fraction of a second before he hides it again. You see it when a valet trips over his own feet, dropping a cloth or a boot, and Napoleon's eyes flick down, eyebrow arching, a soft, muttered, graceful, under his breath before he moves on. Or when someone tries to flatter him too obviously, saying something about glory or greatness, and he gives them that look, flat and amused, before replying, "Yes, yes, I'm sure," as he waves them away with a gloved hand, turning back to his papers. Once, you watch him pause at a mirror, checking the fold of his cravat, hair sticking up in a way that refuses to flatten, and he mutters, "Magnificent," to his reflection with a smirk, before blowing the strand away and pulling on his hat. There's a story the valets whisper about Napoleon waking in the middle of the night after a nightmare, calling out in confusion, eyes wild for a moment, before realizing where he is, sitting on the edge of his cot, rubbing a hand over his face, and saying to no one, "Well, that was unnecessary." Or how he would sometimes mimic the voices of the officers who annoyed him, pitching his tone higher, repeating their words with exaggerated worry before snapping back into silence, jaw tightening, eyes flicking with sharp humor before he moved on. There's a dry, cutting humor in him, but also an odd softness, a way he sometimes laughs when someone says something genuinely foolish, a small, quiet sound, as if he's surprised it escaped him. You see him shake his head, looking down, a smile ghosting across his face before it's gone. He finds amusement in small things. A bird that hops too close to the door, pecking at crumbs. A cat slipping under a table, making him flinch before he laughs softly, shaking his head at himself for the reaction. A letter with a spelling mistake from a secretary, which he corrects with a red quill before writing "careful" in the margin. Even the licorice, sometimes, is part of it. You see him pop a piece into his mouth after a long silence, chew once, twice, and say, "Better than their coffee," with a wry twist of his lips when a servant offers him a lukewarm cup. There's a story, too, of him scolding a valet for leaving a window open, the draft creeping in, making him shiver as he pulls his coat tighter around himself, snapping, trying to freeze your emperor, "Are you?" before softening, shaking his head, muttering, "Close it before we both catch death." You see the way he sometimes stares into the flame of a candle, eyes unfocused, and suddenly blows it out, the smoke curling upward, and he whispers, "Quiet," as if speaking to the darkness itself. And you see him when he is alone, reading a letter, the corners of his mouth lifting at a line only he will ever know, the sound of his quiet exhale filling the small room, a soft, private moment of amusement before the letter is folded away, the smile tucked with it. Napoleon's humor is a quiet thing, a private thing, sharp enough to cut but soft enough to comfort in small doses. It lives in the corners of his mouth, in the arch of an eyebrow, in the quiet mutterings under his breath when the world becomes absurd even for him. And you, standing there, watching him smile at a folded letter, hearing him call out a dry remark to a startled valet, seeing the quick smirk before he tugs on his gloves and moves on, you see him as he truly is. A man who carries the world on his shoulders but still finds moments to laugh at it. A man who is all tension and command but still lets the corners of his mouth lift for the smallest absurdities. Because tomorrow, he will straighten his coat, chew his licorice, mutter his quiet jokes to himself, and keep moving. Because that's who he is. You notice how, at the end of the day, Napoleon finally lets the world slow down. Not stop. Never stop. But slow, just enough for the candle to burn lower, for the air to settle, for the shadows to find their shapes on the walls. You see him sit on the edge of his cot, boots still on, coat still buttoned, the weight of the day pressing into the tightness of his shoulders. He rolls them once, twice, as if shaking off the last arguments, the last notes, the last instruction spoken in sharp, clipped tones. He chews a final piece of licorice, the scent of anise and sharp sugar mixing with the faint citrus cologne that has dulled to something warm and human by now, layered over the softness of sweat and the smoke of the candle. His gloves rest on the table, the fingers folded neatly, ready for tomorrow. You see him glance at them, hand reaching out, touching them softly, a reminder that they will be there when the day starts again. He picks up a letter, maybe one from Josephine, maybe an old note he's read 100 times, letting his eyes trace the words, the ink, the curves of letters that are as familiar to him as the lines on his own hand. For a moment, he smiles. Just a small, tired smile, gone as quickly as it came, leaving only the softening of the lines around his eyes, the gentler set of his jaw. The room is quiet now. The sounds that once pricked at him, creaks, coughs, distant footsteps, have fallen away, replaced by the soft flicker of the candle, the slow rhythm of his breath, the faint rustle of fabric as he shifts, finding a spot that feels right. He reaches up, running a hand through his hair, the strands falling back into place, stubborn as ever. He shakes his head softly, muttering something you can't hear, something for himself, before leaning back just enough to let his shoulders rest against the wall. And he closes his eyes. Not fully asleep, not yet. But resting. Allowing the world to grow quiet around him, allowing the smallness of the room to comfort him, allowing the darkness to feel less like something to fight and more like something to share. You see his chest rise. Full, a soft, controlled rhythm, the breath of a man who has carried the weight of everything, who still does, but who, for this moment, allows himself to simply be. Outside, the world is still moving, still noisy, still messy in the ways it has always been. But in here, in this small room that smells of licorice, cologne, and warm candle smoke, the world feels held, just for a moment. And you, standing there, watching him breathe, watching the candle flicker, watching the quiet settle into the lines of his face, you see him as he truly is. A man who moves the world, but needs the silence to find himself again. A man who straightens papers, adjusts gloves, counts steps, chews licorice, watches corners, and mutters small jokes to himself because it makes the noise of the world manageable. A man who, tomorrow, will wake before dawn, splash cold water on his face, check his gloves, adjust his coat, chew licorice, and keep moving. Because that's who he is. And for now, the candle burns low, the air hums softly, and you let yourself drift with the slow rhythm of his breath, letting the quiet fill the space, letting your own breath match his. Because tonight, it is enough to simply rest, to let the world be small, to let yourself fall into the softness of sleep. Dim the lights. Turn on a fan for a gentle background hum. Let your eyes close, let your shoulders relax, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Because tomorrow will come. And you will be ready,